Erev Tov Rabotai, we are continuing with our Mishna Yomi, Masechet Sheviit. We're up to Perek Gimel, Mishnah Aleph. Today's Mishnah should be Le'ilui Nishmat, Neria ben Tzvedlana, Aranbai, Menuchato Began Eden, Amen. Now Rabotai, we're going to be discussing different laws of fertilizing a field. We know that the rabbis made a prohibition in Isud Rabbanan of fertilizing a field during the year of Shemitah. That is not allowed. Why? Because it's a toladah, it's a subcategory of plowing. Because like plowing, fertilizing makes the ground fit for planting and sowing. Therefore, it is rabbinically asur to do during the year of Shemitah. The Chachamim not only prohibited actually fertilizing the land, but they even made a decree that a person cannot take manure out to his field on Shemitah to store it there in heaps until the next year. And the Rab explains to us that in those times, fertilizer consisted mainly of animal manure. So people didn't want to have the manure in their barn or in the courtyard any longer than they had to. So what would they do? They would remove it even before they needed to use it, and they would store it in piles in the field. Then when the time came, when the time was right, they would take the manure from the pile and they would spread it across the field to fertilize the soil. But the Chachamim said you cannot take the manure out to your field on Shemitah to store it there in piles until the next year, because people might suspect that you intend to use the fertilizer the manure to fertilize the earth with it before the year is over. But the Mishnah is going to discuss when this restriction applies. From when during Shemitah is a person allowed to take out manure to his field to store it there in piles? He's allowed to do so after those who work their fields on Shemitah finish fertilizing for the season. Now the Rav has a different version. He has Mishefsiku Ovre Avera. When the violators, when the sinners who do not observe the laws of Shemitah, when they finish fertilizing the field for the season. Now, once the farmers stopped fertilizing their fields for the season, a person who would take manure out to his field, nobody's going to suspect him of planning to use it that year. Rather, they're going to know that you intend to use it to store it there and use it after Shemitah. Therefore, the decree wouldn't apply at that point. These are the words of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yehuda says, Mishiva shamatok, once the manure has dried up, a farmer can take it to his field for the purpose of storing it, because since dry manure cannot act as a fertilizer, he obviously doesn't intend to use it during the year of Shemitah. Instead, he's storing it there until the next year when it will become usable again after it becomes moistened by the rain. Literally, the words of Rabbi Yehuda is Mishiva shamatok, when the sweet has dried up. Why is he referring to manure as sweet? The one of the Mefarshim explains, the Rav gives one interpretation, but one of the other Mefarshim explains that fertilizer is called sweet because it sweetens and ripens the produce. But in any event, it's Rabbi Yehuda's opinion, only once it has dried up. Rabbi Yossi says, Mishi kasher, once it becomes knotty, and the Mefarshim explain, what does it mean knotty? When it begins to dry up and thicken, and its pieces become like knots. It becomes like knots to one another. Then you could take it to the field and store it there, because even manure in this condition basically is not an effective fertilizer. Therefore, nobody's going to suspect you of intending to use it for that purpose of manure on the year of Shemitah. And the Rab does tell us that there's a very small difference between Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda practically, because as soon as the manure begins to thicken, it dries up. So they're very close to each other. That is the Rabotai of Mishnah Aleph. Mishnah Bet, again, is continuing off what we just said, that after the fertilizing season, a farmer can take the manure out to the field and heap it in storage piles. That was the opinion of the Tanakama. Today's Mishnah is going to teach us in Mishnah Bet that there is a limit to the number and the size of storage piles that you can make, so that we don't want it to look like an act of fertilizing the field. Because again, the first Mishnah was discussing the topic of bringing the manure out to the field. That casts a suspicion of you wanting to use the manure later to fertilize the field. Now this Mishnah is dealing with the very issue of making the piles to store until after Shemitah, because that in its own right might be considered as fertilization. Because the Mefarshim explained in the Usadin, they quoted the Chazon Ish, that even after farmers would finish fertilizing their fields for the season, some would still take manure to their fields and leave it there in small heaps, so that it will be softened by rain and seep into the ground, and that fertilizes the ground in preparation for planting the crops of next year. So even though according to the Tanakama, of Mishnah Alayev that he allows a farmer to bring manure into the field at this time when they would stop fertilizing the land, he can only do so in a way that it doesn't appear to be fertilizing the field with it. Meaning, how would it appear to fertilize the field when you put a lot and leave it in a place and you let it seep into the ground? Therefore, the Tanakama says it has to be clear that you only intend to store it until the next year. Then, when you will remove the manure and from the piles and spread it over the field. So the Mishnah says, "At kama mizablin." How much manure can a person pile in his field for the purposes of storage? Ad shalosh ashpatot lebet se'ah. A person can only make up to 3 piles in each bet se'ah of the field. Now, we said, Rabotai, we explained, a bet se'ah is the area that you need to plant a se'ah barley seeds. It measures 50 by 50 amot, or 2,500 square amot, which comes out to between 6,200 to almost 9,700 square feet. You can make up to 3 piles in this amount. Shel eser mashpelot shel letech letech. Each pile can consist of at least 10 containers of manure, each of which holds at least 1 lesech, which is 15 se'ah. Therefore, each of the 3 piles must contain at least 10 lesech, 150 se'ah. And the Mefarshim explain the word mashpel. We said mashpelot. What does mashpel mean? Mashpel is a container in which manure will be carried out to the field. That's why we're calling it 10 containers of manure. Eser mashpelot. Now, each mashpel has to be at least as large as a lesech, which is between 6.3 to 11 cubic feet, which is the size of a load, the Rab says, that can be carried by a donkey. And the reason that each of the 3 piles has to have at least 150 se'ah is because by requiring the piles to be so large, the Chachamim made sure that when you heap up this pile, it would not resemble fertilizing. It's a lot of manure. Mosefin ala mashpelot, you are allowed to add to the number of containers in each pile, meaning you can make a pile of 20 lesech or more. The larger the pile, obviously, the more likely it's going to be used for storage and not fertilization. Then mosifin ala shpatot, but you cannot add to the number of piles per bet se'ah. You can't put 4 piles per bet se'ah, or 5. It can only be up to 3. Why? Because if he makes more than 3 piles in the area of this size, it looks like you're fertilizing the field. And the Mishnah concludes, Rabbi Shimon says, At al ashpatot, you can even add to the number of piles per bet se'ah, because since he's heaping the manure into large piles and not spreading it, Rabbi Shimon says you don't have the appearance of fertilizing the field. Even if you have 5, 10 piles, obviously it looks like you're trying to store it. But the Rab does tell us, En halakha Rabbi Shimon. The halakha does not follow Rabbi Shimon. The halakha is that you can only make up to 3 piles in each bet se'ah with a minimum of 150 se'ah in each pile. You can add onto the number of containers in each pile, but you cannot add to the number of piles per bet se'ah. That is in Rabotai of today's Mishna Yomi. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen v'amen.